So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Keith Bowers to do this talk for us. Keith has lived in Bath, I believe, for about 7 years. He's a keen supporter of the work of Fairfield House, where the Emperor Haile Selassie lived during his exile, and he's travelled regularly to Ethiopia since 2001, and he's taught in the Journalism and Communications Department at Addis Ababa University. And interestingly, that university is based in the grounds of the Emperor's former palace. Before that, Keith worked at the BBC in London for around 20 years and was an executive producer in news and current affairs. So I know we're in excellent hands for tonight's talk. And at that point, I shall pass over to Keith. Keith, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. This is my first Zoom talk, so we'll see how we get on. Seems very strange sitting at home and either not watching the telly or falling asleep, but I'll do my best. I've had to switch off the feed that shows names and faces. I've recognized one or two friends already though, so that's great, thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining. And I'm going to be speaking for about 45 minutes, I guess, and then there'll be a chance for questions after that. So without more ado, let's crack on and hope the technology works okay. So, we've got a little problem. Right, there we go. So here's our first slide. Here is the emperor here, and one or two of his sons here and here. This was taken in about 1930 in Ethiopia. So the emperor here is around late 30s, 40s, a few years before he came to Bath. Ethiopia was not a modern country at all, although there was a railway, as you see there, that was built by some French engineers in cooperation with the Ethiopians. And it's primarily a highland country, although there are some lowlands as well. And it was a very different world in 1930s to the world of Western Europe. So how did this man, Haile Selassie, end up in Bath? Who was he? And how did the exile go? And actually, what was the impact on him and actually on the city of Bath? That's something I hope to explore as we go through. So before that, though, we have to delve back into the mists of time. This is a stained glass window in Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa, and it shows a meeting between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. Now, in Ethiopian historical thought and identity, this is a very important story. Other people lay claim to this story as well, but in the Ethiopian tradition, all the emperors have descended and kings have descended from these two people. When after they met, a son emerged, Menelik I. And Menelik I was credited with bringing the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem to northern Ethiopia in the town of Aksum, where Ethiopians still believe the Ark resides to this day. Now, Haile Selassie was part of this tradition. Menelik II emerged in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Here's his statue outside St. George's Cathedral in Addis. Menelik was the cousin of Haile Selassie's father. And he looked after the emperor when Haile Selassie's father died, took him under his wing. Menelik himself died in 1913 or so. There was a little bit of a messy sort of handover of power and who was going to be in charge. But actually in 1916, the young Haile Selassie emerged as one of three people running Ethiopia. He was like the crown prince, the prince regent. And he especially did a lot in foreign policy. And in 1923, he advocated Ethiopia joining the League of Nations. a very sort of far-sighted, modern thinking move. His father actually had traveled quite a bit outside Ethiopia, and Haile Selassie was keen to continue this. And in 1924, he came on a trip of Europe. So he actually came to the UK, and he brought the king a couple of lions, which went down very well. Haile Selassie loved lions. He had a few pets. He himself was called the Lion of Judah. And he consolidated his power so much so that by 1930, he was crowned King of Kings, Emperor, in a glittering ceremony attended by dignitaries from across the world, including the Duke of Gloucester from the UK. And this propelled him onto the world stage. Time magazine had him on its cover. And his image was noted, especially in the Caribbean and by African Americans, who had been looking for a Black Messiah to arise from Africa. And they seized onto him. And although Haile Selassie is one of his names, another name he had was Teferi. Now in Amharic, one of Ethiopia's language, Ras means head or prince. So his other name was Ras Teferi. And that's how Rastafari got their name, because they followed in the footsteps and the teachings of Rastafari. Anyway, in this coronation, he put his stamp on the world. People took note of Ethiopia as an up-and-coming country. But after a few years, unfortunately, there was a problem. And this problem lay in the guise of another ruler, Benito Mussolini of Italy. And so, as leader of the fascists, Mussolini had his designs on Ethiopia, partly because he wanted to create prestige for Italy and have a colony in Africa, like so France, Germany, England, etc., etc. But also he wanted to avenge a major defeat that the Italian forces had in 1896 at the Battle of Adwa, when they were defeated unexpectedly by Ethiopian forces. Actually, Haile Selassie's father fought that day. And this rankled with Mussolini. And so in 1935, he invaded Ethiopia. Ethiopia was in no position to fight the modern Italian state, partly because some of Western Europe refused to sell arms to Ethiopia. And so it was a losing battle. The emperor himself, although he was more of a scholar than a warrior, he actually did take part in some battles in northern in Ethiopia, and was wounded when the Italian planes dropped poison gas. As a result of the Italian pressure, the Ethiopian forces had to retreat to the capital, Addis Ababa. And in previous generations, the king or the emperor would either have died fighting in a losing battle, or maybe would have even killed himself. Haile Selassie, though, thought of a modern way, which was to come to Europe and to appeal to the League of Nations. His advisors backed him. And so he and his family made a mad dash along the train line that we saw earlier to Djibouti, where it was arranged that a British naval ship would pick him up. Now, the captain of that naval ship, which was called the Enterprise, he wasn't called Captain Kirk, although he did have a captain's log, Captain Morgan. And this is an extraordinary account of what happened when he arrived in his ship in Djibouti to pick up the royal party. He was expecting maybe 12 in the emperor's family and 7 or 8 servants. Instead, he found 150 people waiting on the quayside, 100 chests of Maria Thaler coins that were going to be used for the emperor's expenses, a couple of lions, a Cadillac and a Buick. The emperor was also liked cars and planes. He liked modern things. He was trying to already modernize Ethiopia. And so the captain was left with a dilemma. What do I do? How do I cope with this? And after a series of negotiations, he agreed to take 50 people. He took the money, but unfortunately the lions and the cars were left behind. And then the ship set sail up the Red Sea. It docks at Haifa, and the emperor and his wife and his family stay in Jerusalem for a while, where they negotiate with the European powers about where the emperor could actually go while he was on his mission to go to Geneva to talk to the League of Nations. In the end, he did a deal to go to Britain. The British government, has to be said, was not that keen on having the emperor around, mainly because they were an old ally of Italy, and they were very aware that Mussolini may become closer and closer to Hitler as a sort of fascist axis. And of course, that was an ever-increasing problem as the 30s progressed. So they didn't want to offend Mussolini. So on the other hand, they saw that there'd been some injustice done to Ethiopia, and so we're trying very hard to maintain that as well. So here we go. The emperor sets sail in another British naval ship, comes via Gibraltar here. At Gibraltar, he's asked to disembark and to then proceed to the UK by a civilian ship, because they didn't want to have to sort of arrive in a sort of state vehicle, a state vessel, sorry, should I say. So then, of course, here he sails up, he lands in Southampton in the spring of 1936, goes by train to London, and at Waterloo Station, he's met by a lot of supporters, although only a low-level Foreign Office official goes to see him. Again, he doesn't have an official welcome. He's not particularly that welcome in London either. He makes a quick visit up to Scotland to see some people there. And eventually, after a few weeks, makes his way to Switzerland, to Geneva, to make his speech at the League of Nations. Now, of course, Switzerland at that time, still is neutral. But of course, is a neighbor to fascist Italy, or to fascist Italy as was. And so, although the emperor at some stage was keen to try and settle in Switzerland, the Swiss government were nervous of that, and so he couldn't. But he did make the speech at the League of Nations in 1936, what is regarded as a very powerful speech, where he spoke about the dangers of the strong oppressing the weak, about the importance of collective security and of standing up against aggression. And he gave a warning to the European powers that maybe Ethiopia one day that's been subjected to authoritarian attack, but it may be the turn of other European powers soon, which of course turned out to be prophetic. Anyway, he was well received in this speech on the whole, but it didn't really lead to anything, because shortly after, the League of Nations decided to lift sanctions that were in power against Italy. And so the emperor returned to the UK, not quite sure what to do and where to go next. So lo and behold, where does he come to but to Bath? And there's the Abbey, sort of quite similar to a view he might have had coming into Bath on the train. He arrived from London and at the beginning of August, and at around 6:30 in the evening. So you may have had a view of the Abbey. He was recommended to come to Bath for some rest and recuperation, actually. As I said, he had some injuries in the war with Italy, and people thought it might be a good place to have a break. And so that's why he came. Of course, presumably he later found out that on the site of the Abbey, the first king of all England was crowned there, Edgar, in 973 AD. So it's probably a suitable place to come for the King of Kings, who saw himself as the 225th descendant in the line of Solomon and Sheba. And he stayed for a month initially before going back to London, and he stayed at the Bath Spa Hotel. Here we are, the lavish grounds, a chance to relax. He came with 3 of his children at this stage. People in the hotel were pleased to see him and gave him a warm welcome. And here we are in the Bath in Time wonderful website that has many pictures actually of Haile Selassie in Bath in 1936. And also, as well as 1936, he also came back on in a visit in 1954. And you can scroll through those and have a look at the Bath in Time magazine. I can't show them all because of sort of copyright reasons at the moment. But you can find some of them actually in my book about the Emperor's Exile, Imperial Exile. I have got permission to use them there, so you can see that. But I would recommend scrolling through and having a look. Have a look at this one particular very briefly, which is the day after the Emperor arrived at the Bath Spa Hotel. Here he is on the steps with the Mayor of Bath, Dr. Carpenter, at the time. The officialdom was very keen to welcome the Emperor. Unlike the national government, the people of Bath and the local government of Bath were pleased to see him and gave him a great welcome. 4 years ago, on the 80th anniversary of the Emperor arriving, we recreated that photo. This is one of the Emperor's grandsons, Prince Michael, and one of, it's actually the great niece of Dr. Carpenter. So we have a relative of the Emperor and a relative of the Mayor actually on the steps of the Bath Spa Hotel. And it was a very sort of powerful event because the Emperor made many connections in Bath with businesses, through schooling, with his children, through other contacts that he had. And so even in 1916, there are many people who attended that meeting whose family had personal stories of engagement with the Emperor. So he is a very sort of important part of Bath's heritage. In the month that he spent in Bath, he visited the Bath Horse Show, he visited various businesses, he went to the spa baths, he had some treatment, presumably for his arm in the spa waters, and generally had a great time and really enjoyed it. He left for London, again, not sure what to do. Did he notice these lions in Bath? Obviously, this one and its partner is at the entrance to the Royal Victoria Park. As I said, the Emperor loved lions. He was known as the Lion of Judah. The Bath coat of arms has a lion in it. And as well as these lions here, there are reported to be over 500 lion door knockers throughout Bath. And so maybe Haile Selassie was aware of this, but probably more to the point, he probably felt at ease because of the genteel nature of Bath. There's a Theatre Royal, the Royal Crescent. He may have been aware that Louis XVIII spent a little time in exile here, and Napoleon III. And he had a good welcome from the people of Bath, who were outraged at what Italy, the fascist Italy, had done. And so they took him to his heart. The Emperor was running out of cash. It was very expensive with his entourage staying in hotels, and it was becoming clear he wasn't going to get back to Ethiopia anytime soon. So his advisors advised him to buy a property, and because of his connections with Bath, the first visit had gone well, he decided to come back and look for a property here. It was far enough away from London not to be on the doorstep of the British government, but it was near enough to get there by train if you wanted to do some under the sort of counter politicking. And so, and of course, property was cheaper here. And this was the property that the Emperor came to see and bought. This is Fairfield House on the western outskirts of Bath on the Kelston Road. It was bought for the princely sum of £3,500, a bargain. Probably around £250,000 in today's money, still a bargain. But it had enough rooms for his family and some of his entourage, some of his advisors, some priests, cook, a butler, and it was a lovely Italianate villa from around 1850 or so. It belonged to the widow of the Lord Mayor of Belfast, so sort of quite a reputable property. And so he moved in with quite a few of his children and grandchildren. Here they are, some of his children here, some of the grandchildren here. Here's Rosa the dog. The Emperor loved animals, especially dogs, but he loved horses and lions as well. And after the tumult and problems that he encountered at home, with the Italian invasion, it must have been a relief to be able to put down a few roots and have most of his family around with him. And to some extent, it was a family house. One of his sons, McConnon, loved tearing around the grounds on his bike. The emperor himself liked playing tennis, and they played tennis there as well. So as well as being the family house, though, of course, it was the seat of the government in exile. Here is a tapestry based on a photograph of the emperor next to Sylvia Pankhurst of the sort of suffragette Pankhurst family. It was taken by the then 8-year-old Richard Pankhurst, Sylvia's son. And that's partly why it's at an angle and it's pointing upwards. And this is quite an important photograph. Sylvia came to give him her support, although she was against the idea of monarchy. Her partner was an Italian opponent of the fascist regime, and she was very keen on fighting for international justice. So she took up the emperor's cause. And many other people came to see him here at Fairfield House, members of the French resistance, some Ethiopian exiles, other people campaigning against Italy. And in the grounds of the house at that stage, there was a coach house where his foreign minister, who'd come with him in exile, he was also there as well. Haile Selassie's cousin, Ras Kassar, a very important official in Ethiopia, he was also around. So there was a lot of letter writing, a lot of contacts, both with Ethiopian exiles in here and across the world, but also with the rebels back in Ethiopia, who were still fighting the Italian occupation. During his time in the UK, he didn't just stay in Bath. He traveled quite a bit around the UK, as you can see from these places that I've marked here. For example, he went to here, Ludlow and Knighton, to see actually the house of the explorer Wilfred Schlesinger, who he'd struck a relationship with and was a good friend. So he visited other friends and contacts around the country. He went to do some politicking under the radar. He went to Cambridge and spoke at the Union there, where the students were very enthusiastic, wore pink carnations in their lapels and cheered the emperor to the hilt. And he also went to various schools where some of his children and grandchildren were. He went right down to Penzance here, where one of his granddaughters was. He went here to Malvern, where 2 other granddaughters went to Clarendon School. Clarendon School is now associated with Monkton Combe School, which has a good link with the emperor's family, because the son of Ras Kassar, so a close relative of the emperor, also went to Monkton Combe School as well. So all these links were established here. And of course, he visited here, he went to Stays just for a bit of Arara, Weston-super-Mare, and other places like that. But Bath, of course, was his main base, and he was spotted walking in the vicinity of the Crescent and Marlborough buildings. He would walk with his dog. He would go out to sort of take letters to the post. He was very polite when greeted. So on the face of it, you thought, well, not a bad place to be, Bath, maybe. But of course, any exile experience is a very tough one. The emperor himself wrote an autobiography while he was here, which was published much later. And he said in that life was very hard. Why was life very hard? Well, partly the climate, partly the food is different, partly the traditions and the culture is different and all that sort of thing. Also, it was hard because the emperor was running out of cash. And so it was very hard even to pay bills like the fuel bills and electricity bills, and to meet the demands of exiles and keeping the sort of government in exile on the road. So he was always strapped financially for cash. So that was hard as well. But the hardest thing, of course, about being in exile is being away from your own home and not being able to be there. Dante himself talked about having to taste someone else's bread, which is very salty, having to walk up someone else's stairs to go to sleep. So very tough. But on top of that, the emperor had an extra burden on his shoulders. some of his own people had accused him of cowardice in leaving Ethiopia to come and try and speak to the League of Nations. That, of course, he was not a coward. It was actually a positive, constructive thing to do. But that was still weighing on him heavily. And even worse, of course, was the news coming out of Ethiopia. Although he was in Bath for 4 years, from 36 to 40, he was well aware of the problems that were still going on in Ethiopia. This is his palace, which he built in 1935. So he moved into that just before he came to Bath. But after the Italians marched into Addis Ababa, they established a base there. So it was full of Italian soldiers and administrators. And in 1937, in the sort of late winter of 1937, there was a big gathering at the palace here. About 3,000 poor people from Ethiopia were gathered because the viceroy at the time, Graziani, was going to distribute charity to them as a sort of way of saying, yes, I'm in charge of this country, but I am looking after the sort of poor and dispossessed. At that time, 2 rebels tried to assassinate him by throwing grenades at him. He wasn't killed, though he was quite badly injured. But in the melee afterwards, the black shirts went on a rampage and shot many of the people who were attending that event. And a few days afterwards, they gathered here at the Italian black shirt headquarters, the Casa Littoria in Addis Ababa, in the Piazza area, and hatched a terrible plot to gain their revenge for what they saw as the attack on Graziani. And they basically rampaged through the city for several days, using flamethrowers, burning down properties, raping and pillaging and stealing. And this was a sort of very black day in Ethiopia's history, and there's still a monument there portraying the suffering of the Ethiopian people. It's estimated that at least 19,000 Ethiopians were killed during this rampage. And of course, news of this was filtering back to the emperor at Fairfield House on the Kelstrom Road. What tremendous pain this must have caused for him and his family and entourage. Worse was to follow in the days ahead. He also heard that his son-in-law, Rastesta, who was the last remaining commander of the official forces, had been captured and summarily shot and killed by the fascist occupiers. So yet more tragedy for the emperor to try and keep a brave face going. As a result, it's clear that the emperor in 1937 and 38 was in a very difficult position and tried to keep his spirits up. Here he is, though, on a trip to Brighton in early 1938. Note he's with just people sitting as a commoner in a sense. He's in a deck chair for 2 pence. This is the man who sat on the Solomonic throne, 225th in line. Here he is now reduced to sitting in a communal garden deck chair on the pier at Brighton. So this was really, really tough and very hard to take. He'd also injured his collarbone, knee a few weeks earlier in a road accident in London. His wife, for instance, Menem, couldn't stand the winter, and she'd gone to Jerusalem for a while to escape, and that went. So he was more on his own, and so this was a really tough period. Note that he's also now sort of adopting more of a Western dress. In the picture I showed you of with his family, he was in an Ethiopian shawl. Here he is now complete in British garb. I'm not sure what the book is that he's holding there. And a little while later, he goes to the Isle of Wight, and note now the flat cap, a sort of more working man's British headwear. And the local paper actually is as bold as to say that the emperor's suffering from depression. We don't know literally officially whether that was true, but it's interesting that they were able to say that, because it was he was in the depths of despair here. That's without doubt. I know I spoke to one of his grandsons who told me that he was at a very low ebb during his exile in Bath. And this was one of the worst periods. And it actually got much worse. This, believe it or not, is an extract from the emperor's first income tax return, the year 1939-40. This is stored at the National Archives in Kew. Why was he paying income tax? Well, before this period, when he first arrived, he was viewed as head of state by the British government. But in 1938, the British government flipped and decided to recognize Victor Emmanuel III, King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, as the rightful head of state of Ethiopia. They changed their policy, and as a result, the emperor was then, among other things, subject to income tax. So he had to pay some income tax. Yet another sort of lack of hospitality, you might say, by the British government, which was not just politics, but I've seen sort of evidence among one or two individuals of sort of downright racism as well, which doesn't really do the British government at the time much favors. So this was the state in which the emperor was after these years, wondering whether he would ever get back to Ethiopia. Was he finished? Well, there may have been one sign that he wasn't. Here's a little theatre cinema, which I'm sure many of you love and know. It's a shame we can't go there at the moment. But the emperor did go there from time to time because he was a friend of the family, the King family. And there he would have a private showing of some of the newsreels of international events. We had the Spanish Civil War in '36, the buildup of tension in Europe as the Nazis invaded various countries. And so perhaps the emperor was getting an inkling that things may be afoot, there may be a change in the universe that may be to his advantage. And as a result of this, in August of 1939, this is a copy of a letter he wrote to the king, basically saying, here I am. If you need me to call on, if you need to call on me, if you need help and support in the oncoming, obviously difficult time that's going to befall us here, I'm here, I'm ready to help. Sorry, let's go. Right, and then a little while later, just actually before war was declared by Britain on Germany in early September '39, the emperor goes to a camp in South Wales Bible College, run by South Wales Bible College, where some of his, again, Mascassa's family was studying. The emperor is staying out on the canvas. He's very much looking the English gentleman here. And what I really like, one of the things about this story is under canvas, but his staff at Fairfield House sent him a fig in the post every day, just to make sure that he was keeping up his diet. And shortly after this, of course, war came, and the emperor's fortunes took a turn for the better once Churchill took over from Chamberlain in the spring of 1940. And of course, shortly after that, Mussolini was at war with Britain. And as a result, Churchill wanted to cooperate with Haile Selassie and send him back as a rallying point to try and drive out the Italians from Ethiopia and, of course, North Africa. And here we are as a map of North African Europe. This story of the emperor's leaving Bath in 1940 and London is an astonishing one. He went with a few of his advisors by a seaplane from the south coast. By seaplane, he had to fly over Vichy, France. And as he got closer to North Africa, he had to take a detour over Tunisia, as it was reported that the Italian Air Force had got wind that the emperor may be in the air and was hunting for him. He then landed in a dodgy refueling stop in Malta and made his way eventually onto Alexandria, where he hid in the port until daylight and was taken away to a yacht club, which used to be run by some Italians, bizarrely. From there, he was taken to Sudan. And it's a long story, but then he had to wait for 9 months while British forces were mobilized, and it was deemed right for him and the British forces to enter Ethiopia, which he did, crossing the border here into Addis Ababa and arrived there on the 5th of May, 1941, 5 years to the day since the Italian forces had entered it. So he was back home. And here he is in triumph in the capital. With him is George Steer, a journalist, but who really was a staunch advisor of the emperor and came with him on that flight from the UK when he came back on that daring mission. When he came back to his palace, he saw this stone creation outside the palace, which was put there by the fascists. There are 14 stone steps here. Each one was put there to mark 14 years of Mussolini's rule by 1936. But you may just notice, if you look carefully, there's a little lion on top. There's the mane, there's the body, showing that the Lion of Judah had the last laugh over the occupying Italians. And this cathedral, Hohenschön's Cathedral, was finished in 1944 as a sort of symbol of victory over the Italians. But actually, although the emperor had good cause to take revenge on some of the occupying Italians, he didn't. He appealed for calm and peace, forgiveness, actually a great statesman-like commitment, really. And even struggled with British administrators so he could keep some Italian builders and road workers and everything else, so to help rebuild the country. So that was a great mark of statesmanship. He didn't forget, though, his British roots and thanks. This is modern Addis Ababa, but this is Churchill Road, which was named after Churchill, who, of course, in the end, sort of encouraged him to come back. And outside of Ethiopia, of course, very large rural country, we have different scenes. This is somewhere called Debrecen, Bishoftu, a watery place. This is the emperor's summer palace. And he retreated to this sometimes at weekends, where he would read in the library. He loved studying. He read a lot while he was in Bath. And he named this house Fairfield House as a reminder of his time in Bath. So there's still a part of, there's a Fairfield House on the Kelston Road, and there's a Fairfield House in Ethiopia as well. It wasn't the last time that he saw Fairfield House. Here it is again. He came back in 1954, as I mentioned earlier. He was made Freeman of Bath. He stayed in the house for a couple of days. He made lots of visits to Morland School, to the Abbey. And again, this time was given a huge official welcome, not just locally, but nationally as well. And he was at the height of his power. And this is back in his palace grounds back in Ethiopia. A lot of things were going well. He tried to bring in education reforms that he'd seen education in Britain. But he started to move away from Europe and much more towards the Americans. And that was a notable feature of his policy. In 1963, he helped to start the Organization of African Unity, which now is the African Union. Headquarters still are in Addis Ababa to this day. But things also were beginning to go wrong. In 1960, there was an attempted coup against the emperor while he was out of the country. Some gunmen took some of his entourage hostage and actually shot some of them dead, actually on the grounds of the palace. After that, he moved. He left the palace to the university where I've taught, and that's indeed, it still is in the hands of the university. But also he came under other pressure as well from students and from communist forces and from disaffected military forces. So much so that he was deposed in a revolution in 1974, and he was imprisoned here on the grounds actually of Menelik's palace. This is called the Inkulal Beit egg house. You'll see at the top the egg-shaped spire of this building. So this was the first time the emperor again had lost his freedom since his time in Bath. So it must have been a really difficult experience again. He lost his kingdom, this time to his own people. And sadly, eventually, the ruling junta, the Derg as it was known, decided to kill him, and he was buried on the palace grounds. The Derg itself was disposed, and by 2000, the emperor was buried here in Holy Trinity Cathedral, where he built as a monument to his victory over Italy. And he's actually in the Lee here at the top is a pictorial depiction of his speech to the League of Nations, where he appealed for peace, collective responsibility, and standing out against oppression. So I think this is a sort of fitting end, really, for the emperor in a place that is associated with Bath. But the story is not over, because Fairfield House was left by the emperor to the people of Bath in late 1950s. He left it especially to help the elderly, and for several years after that, it was a residential home for the elderly. Then it became a day center for the elderly. The BEMSCA, the Bath and Minority Senior Citizens Association, still have sessions here. The Rastafari have an office here and have services here. The Ethiopian community come and celebrate Ethiopian Easter and Christmas. People from Bath who love the heritage and the connection between the city and the emperor, like me, we also love going there and try and support its work. Here's a lovely sculpture of the lion done a few years ago. The Lion of Judah, the spirit, is very much alive at Fairfield House. The council is transferring community ownership to a voluntary group who is going to run the house, to try to raise money to renovate it, to promote the legacy of the emperor and the ties between Bath and Ethiopia. And just the last few weeks in Black History Month, some people from Fairfield House have been in some great assemblies by Zoom, talking about eminent people from Bath. Who was the most famous and best and eminent person to emerge from Bath? Is it Mary Berry? Is it William Beckford? Is it Admiral Nelson? And maybe, in fact, from my view, yes, who is it? Emperor Haile Selassie, an incredibly well-known figure across the world to this day. Bob Marley sung songs about him. He traveled to many countries. He left his mark with the Organization of African Unity. He left his mark on Bath, and we should celebrate this connection and this heritage. And so I, along with many others, are going to be trying to support this work going forward. So I think at that stage, I'll shut up. It's very odd speaking to a computer in my flat, not knowing if anybody's paying any attention at all. But I'll hand back over now to Joe.
Keith, thank you so much. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. I'm a relative newcomer to Bath, and you've just told me a lot of history that I didn't know about the city and about the emperor as well. So thank you. Now, Keith, can I ask you to unshare your screen now?
Yes.
And then we will take questions from anyone who wants to make them. And we already have some questions in writing, so I'll start with one or two of those. So, and I'll take them in the order they arrived. So the first question is from Alison and Chris Bourne. Apologies, I'm not sure whether it's Alison or Chris, or maybe you work as a team. But anyway, I've just read The Shadow King by Marza Mengistu. The emperor comes across as a cultured but rather introspective and sad character in the 1935 war and subsequently, including during his stay in Bath. Is this a fair portrait?
I think there's a considerable element of truth in that. I think, as I pointed out, with all of the pressure that he was under, you saw him on the pier in Brighton, you saw him in the Isle of Wight. He was worn down to a large extent. He said, though, that his faith in God kept him going. And in the end, we did see he made a resurgence with a letter to the king, and then was in a position to go back. But I don't think it's a surprise that he was introspective. Many people who've gone through exile suffer the same thing. Just because you're royalty, or it doesn't matter, well, you're great or you know, a road sweeper, or you're rich, you're poor. For anybody to be in exile is a crushing experience. But of course, he did keep he did have a sense of humor. You know, they did play tennis and table tennis. He did love his children. He was able to enjoy those. He did enjoy friendship of some of the people of Bath. So it wasn't all doom and gloom by any means. But of course, once he got back to Ethiopia, he did recover his mojo big time, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. And Keith, the next question is from Timothy Soanes. It says, is there a record of who the servants were at Fairfield House, and in particular the butler?
Well, I've seen the reference. The butler apparently was called Jesus. I don't know much about him. There were 2 priests at least. I don't know what their names were either, and a couple of cooks as well. As I mentioned, the Foreign Minister Hiroi was there, Raskasa was there, Hiroi's son was also there. He did a lot of the administering of the house as well. But no, I don't. Perhaps someone out there knows more than me. I mean, one of the great things of both writing this book and doing talks about the emperor and being associated with Fairfield House, many people I meet both in Bath and elsewhere actually tell me a new story about someone who in their family or whom they're known has met the emperor, and there's some, so new information is coming to light all the time. But I can't shed too much light on that, I'm afraid.
Okay. By the way, if anyone wants to ask a question in person, even if you already sent a written one, that's fine. Just unmute yourself and start your video, and feel free. It's a very popular talk, this, so there are so many people who are across 2 screens, so I'll flick back and forward, and if you're waving, I apologize if I don't catch you straight away. But the next question is from Hannah Mariam. Good evening. When did Empress Menen go to Jerusalem, and for how long? And she also asks, sorry, I did not catch your comment about why she went to Jerusalem.
Well, she went in the winter of 37-38. I can't quite remember exactly which months, but she went basically for the winter. There's actually a rather sad photograph of her taking leave from London in tears as she's leaving on the train to go. There were some families still left behind in Jerusalem, and some Ethiopian supporters there. So that was partly it, but I think it was mainly to sort of have a bit of a better climate than the winter. She found the winter particularly difficult here, and it was tough on her. What was the last bit of the question?
It was, and your comment about why she was sent to, why she went to Jerusalem.
Oh yeah, so I think I've answered that. Yeah, so yeah. I think that's.
Okay, the next question is from Dick Bateman. I like this one. Do you think you would have liked the emperor? And back then, if you could have asked him a question during his lifetime, what would it have been? Oh, Dick, you're there. Sorry, you could have asked that for yourself. I'm sorry, Dick.
It's okay. Go ahead,
Hi,
Keith.
Dick. How are you doing? Good question.
Doing fine, thank you.
This is great to be actually able to see somebody that's a real person instead of talking to my laptop for 45 minutes. But so what would I have liked him? I think I would have been certainly struck by his charisma. Everybody said what an incredibly charismatic guy he was, and very polite. And I think I would have liked him because he was very dignified. He was very appreciative of being in Bath. He loved his kids. He was a family man. He liked dogs. So I think there was a lot to like. But of course, it would have been only on the surface. Not many people got to know someone as a private person like that. So it would have been the sort of image of the emperor. What would I have asked him? I think I would have asked him, do you think you will ever get back? I would like to have known when, if at all, deep down, that came into his head, and if so, when? I would like to have known that. Had he given up hope?
Thanks, Keith.
Okay, Dick, you're satisfied with that? That's good. From Stuart Grice, what is your take on the criticism that Haile Selassie did not attend to early 1970s Ethiopian famines?
Well, that's a massive, massive subject. And indeed, the 1973 famine, not the Bob Geldof famine, if I may, well, rather horribly describe it as that. No, I shouldn't. No, sorry, that's completely wrong. Right? It's different to the 1984 famine. 1973 famine was very, very bad and very, very dire. And Jonathan Dimbleby made a program for ITV about it, which actually some of the emperor's supporters intercut with some pictures of the emperor feeding his dogs, and made sort of political capital out of that. I think there are probably, yes, of course, the emperor came from a line of nobility and royalty. So was he out of touch with everybody in his country? Did he really realize the scale of this? Or was it so bad? What more could he have done? But certainly his enemies pounced on a vacuum and made capital out of him. And that was one of the reasons why they were able to depose him a year later. Obviously, I know more about the emperor in the 1930s, although I do sort of cover all of his life. But I've always tried hard not to get too involved politically in the 70s and the moves to oppose him. I think one of the ways I try and understand this period, though, is there's a wonderful quote by a historian, Ullendorf, where he says, for the first 2/3 of his rule, the emperor was ahead of his people, trying to modernize, trying to bring in educational ideas, technology, transport. But for the last third, he fell behind. He fell behind them. And this was probably one of the ways in which he'd fallen behind. It couldn't really grasp the scale of this and the impact this would have on the rest of the population. And by this time, of course, the emperor was around 80 years old. Of course, we do have spry and lively 80-year-olds. I'm not saying he was senile, but of course he wasn't at the top of his power. So there clearly was a failure by the state to grasp that famine and do something about it. And I say, in the vacuum, his enemies exploited it.
Excellent, thank you, Keith. I'm coming to William Heath now. William, you'll need to unmute yourself first, William.
Unmute, it's done. Yeah, Keith, thank you. It's lovely talk and things that I hadn't realized, which were really interesting. So I was really surprised to come across the fact that in a new housing estate, Holborn Park, they're still naming the roads there after sort of people with slave trading histories. And doing those talks with schools, I've found that, there's schools that have, houses called Beckford, and University of Bath was going to build a building and call it Beckford, but then they realized there'd been a sex scandal involving Beckford. I just wonder, if you were building a housing estate, do you think that the legacy of Haile Selassie, would that give you kind of names that you would use? Do you think Bath's relationship with that time means that we should be kind of naming streets and sort of schoolhouses and university buildings after him? And which names would you pick?
Well, I would support that, but I think the issue is that not many people in Bath still are fully aware of that. So it might be very difficult to get the buy-in to do that, because they would say, there is, of course, on the site of Fairfield House, Empress Menen Gardens, which were built by the local authority, and they were sheltered housing for the elderly. So they're keeping that tradition alive, because that literally was on the plot of Fairfield House, which was 2.2 acres, and it's much smaller now. Yeah, I would definitely, Sahai, for one, I would definitely do. This was the emperor's young teenage daughter at that time, who was very clever and bright and translated a lot, spoke good English. She went to work at Great Ormond Street in the Children's Hospital as a nurse, took a miserly salary there, and stayed actually a year after her father had left and went back with Empress Menen in 1941. Sadly, she died in pregnancy, a real tragedy that she never, died. She died as a young woman. I certainly think she is worth venerating in actual fact, because she really took to Bath. A lot of residents took to her she made an incredible contribution by serving as a nurse in wartime, of course. You know, she was here till 41, which we forget.
So there's a dress in Fairfield House. Would that have been her dress, that embroidered shirt, do you think? A pale blue embroidered shirt?
Possibly. No, possibly. I mean, there were other, you know, her sister was there, and then there were other, I would be too young for the grandchildren will be too young. I don't know is the answer to that. But, I'll probably think of some more. You can as well. But thank you, William. Yeah, William's been doing some of these assemblies and going great guns. But perhaps you just tell us how the school kids sort of react when you tell them about the emperor.
Oh, well, thank you for asking. I mean, we're very surprised how surprised everyone is. Even the teachers were saying, we have no idea about this. The teachers from neighboring schools, teachers from schools where, you know, where his children and grandchildren attended. And I think what we found sort of in Bath and in Somerset, there's a real lack of Black and minority ethnic culture. So the discovery that an emperor and somebody who's regarded as a god lived in our city just knocked people sideways. And but the vast majority of questions were about his lions and his relationship with animals. And there was one school where they were literally asking, what did he have horses? What breed were the horses? Did he have dogs? What breed were the dogs? And we got to, did he have hamsters? So I think there's something about the humanity of Haile Selassie that really connected with the kids. And the idea that this incredible person lived here and that there's water coming down through the roof of his house down into the hall where elderly people are looked after is just shocking and astonishing to children who come to this history for the first time. So we really, really have to sort out, I mean, Keith's been a fantastic champion of this legacy, but as a community, as a city, we really, really have to sort of sort out how we look after this legacy and take it on board.
Thank you, William.
Thanks, William. I've got a comment or a question really from Reggie Osborne. Reggie, I can't see your image, so I'm guessing you're happy for me to read this for you. But Reggie says, when I was in Asmara with the US Army in 1969, we could not speak to him directly. No one speaks to a god, only through an interpreter, even though he spoke English. The Eritreans there weren't big fans of Haile. They wanted independence, but he didn't honour their vote. Any comments on that, Keith?
Well, again, that's a very that is a big political issue. Eritrea is now independent, and the emperor was trying to hold on to it. So he wasn't very popular there. That's fair to say. The thing, yes, the God thing and not being able to speak to him. I mean, that's part. Presumably, that was there. He was there in a sort of in a diplomatic setting, as it were. Of course, that was part of his persona, his state persona. He was a very complex character, of course. There are also people have told me also in Addis that he would sometimes stop his car when he'd see boys playing. In fact, someone at the embassy in Ethiopian embassy in London told me this, and would give them a few coins. Now, okay, some people may object to that as well, but it just showed that he wasn't totally remote, and he was a family man. But in that setting, the whole again, I'm not a huge expert on that period and the whole Eritrean question. But yes, he was not popular there. But of course, he wanted to hang on to Eritrea because that was Ethiopia's access to the sea.
Please, if you've got any more questions, put your hands up or please send them on text. Keith, I just wanted to ask you about your book. Can you tell us a bit about your book about the emperor and what, how difficult it was to select what went in and went out of that and what you didn't include, because there's obviously such a lot to say in his story.
Well, I tried to focus on the exile period, and I tried to focus on the exile experience, which also interested me. I go into the book, quite a bit about other people who've been through that exile experience. But I felt like I've done tonight, to understand the emperor, you have to understand where he came from the Solomonic dynasty and how people regarded him. And then also where he ended up, what happened to him afterwards, both good and bad. So I had to try, but that is a very complex, as we even discussed the whole, you know, Eritrea is a very complicated issue. The rise of the Derg and the communist revolution, those are very complicated. There's, so how much of that do you get into without being accused of just glossing over it? And I also didn't want to get into either defending or attacking the emperor's political record. I wanted to try and treat him as he was when he came to Bath. He was a family man in his mid-40s, quite new as a king of kings to some extent. And before all what happened later, and it's very easy to look back at the emperor as he was in Bath in 1936 and say, oh, that's the guy that didn't do enough about the famine in 1973. But of course, he didn't know that then. It hadn't happened. So I was trying and look at him through eyes that were not, obviously we know that information, so you can't disinvent it, but you have to try and put that to one side and try and understand him as he was when he came. So that was the biggest challenge for me, I think. Because of my association with Ethiopia and been there a lot of times, I was very keen also to bring in the Ethiopian angle, because a lot of books that are written about the emperor, about biographies that just say, both in English and in Amharic, they say, oh, he went into exile for 4 or 5 years. He spoke at the League of Nations and he was in Bath and it was cold and rainy, and then he came home. But for me, this was a seminal part of his life. It had a huge influence on him. So I wanted, but equally, if you write about him from an English point of view and just talk about Bath, and all you talk about is, you know, going to the post box and people he met and that sort of thing, you have to understand his place in the sort of Ethiopian historical pantheon as well. So that's what I tried to do. And doing that, again, how much do I talk about Ethiopia? Am I writing for an Ethiopian audience? Because a version was printed in Ethiopia, so sold quite a few copies there. Am I writing for a British audience who don't know much about Ethiopia? I'm also writing for an audience there are many people on this Zoom tonight that know more about Ethiopia and know more about British foreign policy than I do. So again, how much detail do you go into? So in the end, I just tried to keep a story going and tried to keep a sort of personal, some anecdotes and some descriptions, as well as tackling some big themes, which I think I got into. I got into the whole problems with the British government in the 1930s and its approach to African colonies at that time. So I got into some of that as well. So I did try and tackle a few issues, but yeah, I mean, you can't write a book to please everybody. And but I think I tried to fill a niche that no one else has done, really.
Thanks, Keith. It's a question from Stuart. Stuart says, what tribal background did he come from? And where does that stand in relation to the very sectarian direction of existing Ethiopian politics?
That's another complicated, long.
You're getting all the tough ones tonight, Keith.
Well, he was a mixture. He had a mixture of blood, actually. He had Amhara, Oromo, he certainly was for one Ethiopia, that everybody should be together, as it were. And I think that's one of the interesting things now, without going into a long lecture about the current political situation in Ethiopia. The Oromo are the largest group, maybe 6% of the population. The Amhara, maybe 25%. The previous government to this one was actually mainly run by people from Tigray in the north, who formed only 7% of the population. So now you're beginning to get a bit of a melting pot where some of the Oromo population is beginning to say, look, we've been marginalized and left out, which is a lot of truth in that. We now need more power and influence. There's been a bit of a vacuum in Ethiopia since 2012, when Prime Minister Meles, who was a bit of a strong man and had been in power for nearly 30 years, he died. And that legacy is being fought over, in a sense. The current Prime Minister has several I think his mother is Amhara and father is Oromo, if I'm correct. So he's trying to bring these sides together, but unfortunately there are elements on all sides that are trying to push forward the sectarian divide. Some people even might say, might Ethiopia even split up into constituent parts? But the Prime Minister is pushing a sort of unity Ethiopia together message. But that was the message that the Emperor was pushed, but he's not very popular with some of the Oromo. Particularly, they don't like Menelik II, who took Haile Selassie under his wing, because they felt he was very sort of vicious towards the Oromo, so they don't like him. So, yeah, I mean, it's tricky. This is that's several books on its own. Forgive anybody who knows it a lot more about it than me, whether that's just sort of skating over the surface, but it is complicated.
Okay. Oh, Betty. Betty would like to ask a question. Yeah, go ahead, Betty.
It's, Keith, welcome and thank you. Can you tell us more about his religious involvement while he was in Bath?
Yes, well, he had a very strong faith. He was an Orthodox Christian, part of the sort of Coptic tradition, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. When he came to Bath, they turned the greenhouse in the garden into a church. They got a consecrated tablet that originally came from Ethiopia, was in Jerusalem. It arrived from Jerusalem, and they would have services in there. And so he talked about his faith a lot, the Orthodox Church. But he loved also visiting churches in Britain. He went to St. Stephen's here in Bath. He went to Bristol Cathedral. When he went to Brighton, he'd go to the local church there. He went to the Abbey here and everything else. And as I showed you that photo of him going to the Bible College of Wales. So he even has some links with more sort of conservative evangelicalism as well. So yes, he had quite a strong Christian tradition. Ethiopia has been a Christian country longer than Britain has, and it's got a great Christian heritage.
Okay, I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so any last questions, please get them in. From Kiri Herbert, what was the genesis of Selassie becoming the center of the worldwide movement of Rastafarianism, and how aware was he of this?
Well, I think towards the beginning I mentioned they took his name, Rastafari, Rastafari, that he was regarded as Messiah from Black Africa that would liberate the Black population. That's how he shot to prominence. Of course, many of the African-American community pushed this image. He went on a ticker-tape reception to Harlem in 1955. A lot of African-Americans sort of publicized all this. Some Rastafari who started following him asked for some land to be established in Ethiopia, which he did in Sheshemene, which is in the south of Addis Ababa. It's still there, that piece of land, to this day. Was he aware of it? Yes, he was, and he was obviously, he was a very polite man, and so he wasn't critical of them. But of course, he was an Orthodox Christian, so he couldn't claim to be God. So, but he didn't sort of push that issue with them. He did go on a visit to Jamaica in 1966, where thousands of people turned up at the airport to greet him. So yes, he was aware that people were following like this. And of course, in subsequent years, Bob Marley has written many songs about the emperor. And so, he's famous still in that community. The Rastafari, still a very thriving community here in Bath. So he was aware of them and gave them support to a considerable extent by giving them the land in Ethiopia.
Okay, I'll just combine a couple of questions here, William, if you don't mind. William is asking, do we know where he worshipped regularly? Presumably you mean while he was in Bath.
His greenhouse, yeah. That's
right.
Yeah.
And And Stuart wants to know, does the Ethiopian Coptic Church in the UK have any Fairfield House links?
Does it have what, sorry?
Any links with Fairfield House?
I don't know the answer to that, whether there are any official links. I know there's definitely, I think a couple of churches in London, I may be wrong, well, there's at least one I know of. Visitors do come from London, and of course, probably some of them are Orthodox goers. Probably, I don't know if there's anybody listening who actually knows more about that than I do, but I don't know if there is. But there are a lot of links with the Ethiopian community. So there are many stakeholders in Fairfield House, as well as the Rastafari, say the Bath community here, the Bemska, day center people, and so it's like, I suppose it's its own UN to a degree.
Excellent, Keith. Thank you very much. I think our time's about up. So I'd like to thank you very much, Keith, for a really, really enjoyable talk.
Thank you. I think I'm waffling now, so it's probably a good time to stop.
No, you're not waffling at all. And also thanks to everyone for some really terrific questions. In a few weeks' time, this talk will appear. If you want to watch Keith again and again and again, as I'm sure many will, this will appear on our YouTube channel, which importantly is not the BRLSI YouTube. If you go to YouTube, you must search virtual BRLSI, and you'll find this and many, many other talks on there on all sorts of subjects. But again, Keith, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful evening, and thanks to everyone.
Well, thank you so much for listening. And to say it was a bit of a weird experience for me, but I hope you got something for it. Apologies if I offended anybody or glossed over something that I shouldn't have done, but thank you so much for the questions. You've been a great audience, even though I can't see you, or at least I've just seen you now. Thanks a lot.
Well,
Thanks, Keith. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Lots of messages saying thank you for a great talk, Keith. So well done. Thanks, everyone. And good
Thank
night.
you.
Yeah,
Bye.
Good night, all.
Bye. 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 Bye.